Okay, so continuing on with chapter six, one of the things that research has shown to us that really regulates what we focus our attention on are tasks. Okay, so when we're doing things, right? It turns out that the demands of of manipulating things in the outside world or getting something done overrides stimulus saliency. So, in other words, when you are focused on doing something, your visual attention is focused exclusively on the things, the objects in your environment that you need to do that task. We know this to be true from your own personal experience because of the problem with cell phones in the car, right? So one of the things that you might be doing in stop and go traffic is looking at your cell phone, and you think, well, I'll focus on my cell phone and I'll be, reading an email or sending texts or whatever or doing Facebook on my cell phone, and I'll be able to tell whenever a brake light flashes in front of me, and it turns out you can't. It's something that is very difficult, if not impossible, to do, right? To focus your attention exclusively on your cell phone and at the same time detect a change in saliency or a change in your field of vision when the brake light comes on. It's something we can't do because we're focused more exclusively on the phone. Um, Eye movements and the fixation of the eye movements are very much focused on the task at hand. So there was an experiment that was done, Jovanovich, Mizik, and Hayo in 2009, and basically what they did was they had the subject walk around a track. And as they were walking around the track, they were kind of turning a corner. So they couldn't see the entire track, and there were corners that they had to turn. So every time as they were walking along the track, basically, new sections of the track would appear, and they would just walk around this track. And there were three people on the track that were walking in the opposite direction. One of them was one they call the rogue, and this person, whenever this person appeared on the track, they would change their walking path and try to run into the subject. The other person was called risky, and what they would do is they would change their path, but they would never run into the subject. They would just look like they would, and then they would just kind of like go back to where they were walking. And then there was a third person walking on the track called safe, and the safe person would just walk right past the subject, and they would never get close to them, right? So what do you think happened in terms of attention? Well, visually, what was happening was eventually the subjects would learn that one of the people would be trying to run into them. The other person would almost but start to run into them but wouldn't, and then the third person would not run into them at all. And it turns out that the person that was the subject in the experiment was spending a lot of time focused on the movements and actions of the person that was running into them, and middle amount of time on the person that looked like they were going to run into them, and hardly any time at all focused on the person that was running into them. Notice this was uh, uh, exclusively related to the task at hand. In other words, the task was to keep walking and to avoid to avoid any hitting anybody, right? That was basically what they were told to do: walk around the track and don't run into anybody. And the task was, I guess, made more complicated by having these people that would run into you. And anytime this person appeared who they learned who was going to run into them, the subject would focus exclusively on that person, right? Just looking at that person and making sure that they knew what was happening at all times. Another type of experiment that's done is, related to specific tasks. This one is related to the task of making a peanut butter sandwich. Um, the sequence of events. You grab the bread, you get the bread out, and then you get the peanut butter, and you open the jar, you get the knife, and then you spread the peanut butter on the bread. Well, if you look at the tracking of the gaze and the movements that are associated with when a brain is executing this task, you'll note that the gaze is very much focused on the specific step in the task. So A is the first point in this diagram where the gaze is focused, where fixation is focused, right? And that's because we focus on getting the bread out. And then we focus on B, which is the plate, localizing where the plate is, right? And then we put the bread on the plate. And then we focus our attention on C, which is the jar, right? Making sure we know that that's a jar of peanut butter, and then we focus on, grabbing the jar, unscrewing it, determining when it's unscrewed. Then we move our gaze over to the knife, and then make sure that we get the peanut butter on the bread, right? So our gaze is perfectly timed and focused with the steps that we need to execute to do a certain task, right? Um, so once we do focus our attention on a spot for whatever reason, either because it's novel and salient, or because we're doing something, right? Like making a sandwich. Once we do focus on a spot, what sort of processing takes place of the thing we're looking at, right? So there's a lot of research on this, right? So one of the concepts to understand this research is the concept of spatial attention. And this is when we focus on specific locations in our scene, right? In our visual field. We focus on a specific spot, and it's called spatial attention, right? And in a classic experiment by Posner, right? Um, Basically, let me show you the picture here, right? So basically, what happened was, here's the experiment. You would get subjects were put in this experiment where they would see a cue. So they were told to look at this spot right here, right? So stare at that spot, and then they would see a cue, which in this case was an arrow pointing in either that direction or that direction, right? And then after the cue was flashed, they would see the target, and they were told to respond to the target, where it was, right? And they were told to respond if either the target was valid or invalid. If the target was valid, it meant that it would appear in the spot that the cue said it would. So in this example here, the cue is pointing here, and then the target appears here. That's a valid trial. And then there were invalid trials where the target was pointing in one direction, but the cue appeared in the other direction, right? Very simple task, right? Just tell me which is valid and which is not valid, right? You push a button for valid and you push another button for invalid. Pretty straightforward, right? You would think, well, how hard can it be? There shouldn't be any difference. Well, there is a difference. It turns out that the reaction time to respond to a valid target is almost half of the reaction time. In other words, the time it took to squeeze the button after you see the target. The reaction time is almost double that of the valid, meaning that, and one of the interpretations that Posner made of this result is that we're focusing our attention on this spot, right? So that's where our processing is. If we have to shift our processing to another spot because it was an invalid trial, that's going to involve some overhead processing time. Okay, so whenever we are dealing with unexpected unexpected things appearing in our environment, that's gonna necessitate some extra processing, only because we are focusing our visual attention on one particular spatial location when we have to go and shift on another spatial location. If you're already focused on a particular spatial location, you're not going to have that extra processing overhead. You'll see, what you expected to happen will happen, and you'll hit the response, right? You can think of our visual attention, this little focused spot we're focusing on, like a spotlight, right? We only have so much attention to give, right? We cannot focus our attention on everything. So you people who think that you can text and drive or that you can multitask, right? Even multitasking is kind of a form of this thing. You can't, right? We're not good at it. So our attention spotlight is going to be focused on just one area at a time to the detriment of the other areas. We're not going to be focusing so much energy here, right? All of our processing, all of our understanding of what's going on in the environment is going to be focused really on this spot, on whatever particular spot our visual attention is focused on, right? So this was demonstrated by an experiment by a guy named Egley. Basically, the experiment worked like this, right? So kind of similar to the first experiment that you saw, right? You had these two separate entities, right, that you had to focus on, this rectangle and this rectangle, right? And what would happen is that a cue would appear lighting up one of the rectangles, either A, B, C, or D, right? And then a target would appear, right? So the cue would come on and then go off, and then a target would appear. And you were responsible for pushing the button, or telling where the target appeared, A, B, C, or D, right? Well, it turns out that if you were presented with a cue, say that to focus your attention on A, and then the cue goes off, and then then the A is flashed, right? It turns out that your reaction time is pretty good. It's at about 324 milliseconds. If, on the other hand, the reaction time was on B, it would be longer, 358 milliseconds, which is to be expected, right? Because A and B are different, right? But they're on the same rectangle, right? A and B. The really interesting finding was that if the rectangle flashed on C, so you got cued on A, right? You got cued on A, but the rectangle flashed on C, the reaction time was even longer, right? I mean, you might expect that the reaction time between C and B would be the same, right? So if you got flashed on, if the cue flashed on A, and then flashed on B, and then the B lit up or C lit up, you might hypothesize that it should be the same, right? Because it's not A, it's either C or B. But it turns out that having to focus your attention not only on different spots but also on different objects adds even more um, overhead to our ability to process visual information. So really the reason that this reaction time was longer than this reaction time is simply because we're having to focus our attention not only from a different spot on an object, but a different object entirely, right? So there's a little bit of not only positional issues here, but also a semantic understanding that you're looking at two separate objects. What's really interesting is that you can make this effect go away. If you connect both objects with a third rectangle and then do the same experiment, it turns out that the difference between C and B goes away, which is really cool, right? So in other words, the reason for that is because we are perceiving all the rectangles as being one whole. They're connected somehow by one whole. It's very much of this principle of continuity that we see from the Gestaltists, right? If we look at is this an animal behind a tree, or is it and this picture's in your book, I think, on page 134. Is this an animal behind a tree, lurking behind the tree, or is it two stumps, right? One stump here and one stump here. We're perceiving it as a whole because we don't see the middle, and we have this Gestalt propensity, this Gestalt process that allows us to look for meaning and make things whole. Another type of experiment is the way that attention can influence the way things appear, right? So this is an experiment by Carrasco, right? And basically the way the experiment worked was this, right? So a fixation dot was first presented to the subject, right? And so they were told to stare at this dot. And then a cue was flashed very quickly, either on the left or the right, and then the stimuli were presented, all while they were still fixated on this dot. Now, the stimuli were these graded lines, right? These graded gray and white and black lines, right? Um, Now you would expect, right? If I told you to fixate on this dot and I just flashed these two guys at you, right? You would expect that they should look the same, right? They should look the same if they are the same, right? And if there's slight differences, you might be able to detect that. Well, the results were really interesting and showed the effects of attention processing. So when there was a big difference in the contrast, the dot had no effect. So in other words, if we go back here, if this was like really, really dark and light, and this was just very vaguely dark and light, you could tell immediately which what the difference was. Right? It would make no difference, right? So I would fixate, flash a cue real quick, and then show you these. You'd be able to tell me, oh yeah, they're different, and this is the more contrasted one as opposed to this one. That would be no big deal, right? Um, However, here's the weird thing, right? When the contrast was the same, so like this one, for example, if the contrast was the same, you would tell me, in this example here, you would tell me that this one had a greater contrast than this one. So in other words, just by virtue of the fact that you're focusing one side versus the other side, you're focusing your attention on one side versus the other side, it is changing your perception of the contrast between the grades.